It's the 31st of May 2006, and we're here in Oslo as part of our Parents of the Field project, interviewing Dr. Håkon Wiberg, to whom we're very grateful for giving us at such short notice this time to talk about the early days of the peace and conflict research field. Thank you very much, sir, for agreeing to talk to us. Let me start at the very beginning. In the early days of peace and conflict studies, people came into the field from all sorts of different backgrounds, some sort of personal histories, particular disciplines, intellectual histories. What was yours, and how did you become part of the field in those early days?
At that time, I was a mathematician. My first years were mathematics, and then I moved over to philosophy and eventually wrote my first thesis in that. Background was that in the years around 1960, Sweden was very close to getting a nuclear bomb. It was proposed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force in 1952.
As early as that?
Yes, but he hadn't sufficiently anchored it with the other services. But in 1954, when the Swedish Commander-in-Chief was to present his different budget alternatives for the coming 5-year period, all of them, even the cheapest, contained sizable sums for research on how to make nuclear bombs. 1957, there was first decision on that, saying that the Defense Research Institute was permitted to carry out something they called protective research, the logic being that, well, even if they will not make bombs, they will need to know more about bombs to protect against them. At that time, the idea of the Swedish military was, we can cope with this if we get a stronger air force. By that time, Sweden had the third strongest air force in Europe. If we get better protective rooms, and if we also have nuclear weapons, because that would take away the advantage that a possible aggressor had in forcing the Swedish army to disperse in order not to give too good targets. But if Sweden had nuclear weapons too, it would force a possible aggressor to disperse its attack. Well, that was the official line of argument at that time. In 1957, there was a public opinion poll with a slight majority for getting them. The party system was split. It's well possible that if there had been a free vote, it would have been 4. The issue was handled by Prime Minister Tage Erlander and his young assistants in this issue is called Olof Palme. And the next decision was 1959, where again they decided on something called extended protective research, which meant that the Defense Research Agency could do anything they liked as long as they didn't call it making bombs. The problem for Prime Minister Erlander was, on the one hand, to keep the consensus between the major parties in government and opposition about defense issues that one had had for a long time, and on the other hand, to prevent the party, the Social Democrat Party, from breaking up on the issue, because there were in the party some of the grand old men were for and some of the grand old men were against. I first came into this in 1960 or 61, something called the Anti-Nuclear Weapon Committees in Sweden, and became a rather extensive movement. I mean, at most about 1% of the Swedish population were in these commissions, and we printed pamphlets, we debated, we marched, and doing all the normal things. And then it struck myself during the debates with some of the military people that they didn't seem to know more about this than we did. So it might be a good idea to try to get to know more. And that was what got me into peace research. And the first lecture, I think we had as a guest in Lund in 1961 or 62. I think it was 61. Johan Galtung. And I heard my first Galtung lecture. The person who was the driving force, the spiritus rector, was called Bengt Höglund, a literary historian. And he was a former sergeant and then having become a conscientious objector. And the beginning was that something called the Scandinavian Summer University had study circles in peace research in 62, 63, 64, perhaps even 65. So we had in each university city there was a group of people working with this.
So Scandinavian meant people coming from outside Sweden as well.
Well, yes, I mean Nordic as we call it, so as to make it clear that Finland is also included, which is not obvious if you say Scandinavian. But Nordic has different connotations in English than it has in our languages. So two things happened. On the one hand, from 1964-65 and onwards, Johan Galtung, who was then the founder and director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, was giving very concentrated courses of 1 week. And there, the first generation of peace researchers in the Nordic countries would participate about peace theory, about conflict theory, about methodology, and almost the entire first generation of peace researchers, those who are now professors or senior lecturers and so on, had their first intense learning from Oslo. So from that point of view, Oslo is a very good city to interview in. And then the other thing that happened was that gradually we were getting something started in 1965 with the vice chancellor of Lund University, Philip Sandblom, back to giving our group $1,000 a year to arrange some seminars. And we also got a board of university professors. Gradually the sum increased. It came from the university and later on, I mean, from the National University Agency. In 1971, the first positions as assistant professor in peace research came simultaneously in Lund and Uppsala and in Gothenburg.
So the three came together. I hadn't realized that.
They came at the same time. Yes, I mean later on Uppsala and Gothenburg got chairs in the mid 80s, whereas Lund withered after at the late 80s for various bureaucratic reasons.
So, what did you think you were getting into at this time? I mean, peace research in England at the time, we were talking about conflict research rather than peace research. So, was there any difference in your mind, or did you come across the difference at all?
Everywhere, I mean, baptism was difficult because at that time, I mean, peace standing by itself, I mean, sounded dangerously leftist somehow. So usually peace and conflict, or conflict and peace, or something else was thrown in to make it sound more respectable than just peace.
But you sound as though you don't think there was that much. It made that much difference beyond the symbolic.
Not much, not much. But the symbolic was sometimes important in terms of achieving legitimacy and funding and so on. But what happened in some cases was that the first official name was something of peace and conflict, and then one gradually dropped the "and conflict." Oslo had peace research from the very beginning. The Swedish ones originally was peace and conflict, and then some of them still keep it. Lund dropped the "and conflict." Gothenburg, I don't recall for sure.
Can we go back for a minute to the story about the Swedish nuclear weapon? What happened with that eventually? Was the campaign successful?
I could say yes, but I would be boasting a bit. Because already a few weeks after Hiroshima, the Swedish commander-in-chief appointed a committee to find out what this was about. Sweden was also early out, starting its first nuclear reactor in 1947 or 48, and deliberately picked the reactor type, the dual-use type that could be used either just for enriching fossil fuel for energy production, or could be used for enriching it further to get weapons grade material out of it. And it started, as I mentioned before, started becoming an issue already in 1952. Then it was still fairly technical, but when the commander-in-chief had asked at all budget levels for it, and when the first parliament decision came, there started first a small group of Swedish artists and intellectuals called the Action Group Against Swedish Nuclear Weapons. And then what was more of a mass movement started around 1960, the so-called anti-nuclear weapon committees. When the issue was first discussed by the military in 1952-54, then the general perception of nuclear weapons was the same as in Britain or the United States. I mean, nuclear weapons were more bang for the buck, but not unique. There were few people who had realized at that time how unique nuclear weapons were, and but between the mid-50s and the mid-60s, on the one hand, the bang had increased, I mean, from what was then thought as Hiroshima size to thermonuclear weapons 1,000 times heavier than Hiroshima. Second, at the beginning of the discussion, the only vehicles were bombers. And the Swedish Air Force argued that we can protect Swedish airspace if we just get a bit more. But then came the first intercontinental missiles, and that meant that the perception of nuclear weapons slowly changed, I mean, to being very much more dangerous and very much less possible to protect oneself against in any way.
Right.
So in the early 60s, the military started backing down. The commander-in-chief still argued for acquiring nuclear weapons in his quinquennial report in '62, but then argued in such a way that some of the arguments could just as well be arguments against. The last attempt from the commander-in-chief just to get some research funding was in 1965, was turned down. And then the issue died out, I mean, with Sweden joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty in '68, although it has been documented that some people at the Defense Research Agency continue doing some experiments with plutonium up to the early 1970s. But after 1965, it has been a non-issue.
Yeah. Okay.
Non-issue in Sweden. I mean, no major political party has ever proposed it again. When I said before that the answer was yes, but that would be to boasting, it was that on the one hand the geopolitical aspects had changed, providing much weaker arguments than before. I mean, Sweden could have built a nuclear weapon in the early 1960s if it had decided to do so. But the geopolitical situation had changed to make it weaker, and then we had the partial test ban treaty in 1963, raising the question: well, where would one test?
Right.
Swedish nuclear weapons, and then the military were backing down. Because when I was debating with the Swedish colonel at that time, I mean, the military still had the slogan that without nuclear weapons, Sweden cannot be defended. But then some of them came to think, when it appeared that it was no longer sure that the decision process would lead in that direction. And of course the issue, well, what if we don't get nuclear weapons? Then people might ask, well, since you have said that Sweden can't be defended without nuclear weapons, why keep it in defense at all?
Yes.
So already in 1961, the Air Force General Almqvist was writing a letter to one of the tops in the Conservative Party, saying, "Dear brother," and the point was that it's more important for us to get a good defense expenditure agreement than to push on with this nuclear weapon thing. So the military pushed less and less from the early '60s, and then I think we did have quite some effect. I mean, our opinion-making efforts. In 1957, the public opinion poll in Sweden gave slightly more for than against nuclear weapons. 5 years later, in 1962, I seem to remember, the public opinion poll gave about 2 to 1 against.
So it was a big shift.
A number of things had changed in how much weight to ascribe our opinion-making efforts among several other things, geopolitical and national political and so on, will of course have to be a matter of speculation. But I sometimes, I mean, when I'm lecturing to younger people, I say, well, things work. I mean, I marched against Swedish nuclear weapons. We didn't get any. I marched against apartheid. It's gone. Marched against Vietnam War. It ended. I marched against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They went out. And now we're marching against the war in Iraq. Don't give up, it works.
The word that keeps coming up in what you're saying, though, is against, and what you've emphasised one side of the development of peace research in Sweden as being something that started as being against. But what was the positive aspects of peace research that attracted you, apart from the fact that it sort of, I think it fitted into the philosophy against the bomb?
Well, some of us came from the peace movement generally, or the anti-nuclear weapons movement specifically, to peace research. Some of the early people came from elsewhere. Far from all of the nuclear weapons resistors were radical pacifists. Many were not. Far from all of the early peace researchers were pacifists. Many were not. This was one of the, this was in Sweden the first thing that really pushed, because there was a considerable risk that Sweden would become a nuclear power. And the opinion initially very evenly split on that. I think another thing, and that was disseminated rather much from Oslo and from Trio, was the idea that until now research related to areas on peace and war and so on had been pretty steeped in traditional realism, and had seen the state, or possibly the alliance, as a central subject. And peace research then seemed to offer a way of trying to understand what was going on, not from the point of view of single states or alliances, but from a more systemic, global perspective. And it seemed to offer other ways than war to handle conflicts, such as economic sanctions. That was our early mistake. I now realize that economic sanctions can be far more deadly than war. Or non-violence. There were many Gandhi fans in the early movement, and I still regard him as the greatest statesman in the 20th century, liberating all of India without killing anybody. We had a conviction among many of us, very young people at that time, that we are brighter than they. We can find alternatives, we can look at things from a more elevated perspective, we can discover new mechanisms, and furthermore, we have data to back it up with.
Yeah, I mean, that was the interesting thing, that it was research, and therefore, almost by definition, involved a potential place, at least in the universities. But did you find that was a struggle to get it accepted as a legitimate focus of study in Swedish universities?
It was a struggle, but we were rather successful.
More successful than many other places I can think of. How did you bring that off?
And that was different in different places. To some extent, by being bright. Some of us were among the best students and junior scholars in our classes. And to some extent it was due to fortunate external circumstances. I mentioned before that the person who got us our first small grants to arrange seminars was the vice chancellor of the Lund University. He was himself politically conservative, He had previously been in the city council for the Conservatives, but at the same time, I mean, he was a liberal in the sense of being open-minded and tolerant. So he thought us interesting and backed us up. And until a few years ago, he died 1 or 2 years ago at the age of 97. I continued sending him off prints now and then with thanks for the starting help. It was also that peace research was in general Sweden. Yes, because in 1964 one was celebrating that it was 150 years of peace in Sweden, 150 years since the last participation in any war. And the idea then arose to celebrate this by starting what eventually became SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Right, yes.
The exact history behind that is interesting because it became success. There are so many parents.
Oh yes.
Prime Minister Erlander, Alva Myrdal, who was for a long period Minister of Disarmament, even some of the leading military people. So there were many proud claimants of parenthood. But this also meant that the term peace research became legitimate. So it was decided in 1964. It started working in 1966. And it may be that we out of the university were to some extent riding on the prestige tails of this big government-sponsored project.
But it was a government-sponsored project, and it's one thing that we find now, I think, in the United States slightly curious, because the peace research, conflict research movement in the States tends to shy away from government and to regard it as being, somewhat dangerous and dubious to be too closely associated with the government. I mean, you never seem to have that problem in Scandinavia.
Here it was government that started it. I mean, the Stockholm Institute,
yes.
which was in the beginning very much bigger than a small group of universities. Well, what happened was that there was a division of labor, although I never agreed on anything, which was that the university groups, I mean, they did pretty much of theoretical analysis, whereas SIPRI for a long time stuck close to things that could be done with impeccable methodology and so on, starting the annual publications on arms expenditures, arms trade, and so on, and also quite a bit of international law about specific types of weapons, and being very much either empirical or legal, or accounting for negotiations of various kinds, but largely staying out of theoretical analysis, because to draw a line between there and normative and policy-oriented things is quite difficult, and that was something that PRIO would not get drawn into, and we others had nothing against being quote-unquote drawn into.
So what particular line of thinking did you pursue at Lund? Now, you were there until, remind me.
I was there until I left my chair. I mean, I went into philosophy then in the 70s I was assistant professor, and later on social professor in peace research. In the 1980s I was professor of sociology, and then in 1988 I left for 13 years in Copenhagen as director of the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute. Well, I recall some of the very earliest pieces of research we actually did. What I did to start with was getting quite a bit into game theory as an intellectual instrument of conflict analysis. That was from, I think, in 1965 plus minus a year that I published a compendium at the Department of Philosophy on game theory and its use for conflict analysis. Parallel with that, I was working with a friend at the Department of Sociology. Excuse me, Department of Psychology.
Psychology, okay.
Psychology, making experiments with games, having people play games and see, what affected whether they were playing more cooperatively or more conflictual, and how that depended on things as length of the game, size of the stakes, various aspects of personality, and so forth. That was in relatively early days, and then especially later on, it became a big thing with journals of its own and so on.
Yes, indeed.
I think the third thing I took up was 1967-68, writing about the effects of economic sanctions.
Yes.
In an anthology that was put together by Peter Wallensten in Uppsala, who is now professor of peace research there. And then ramified out into different things. Yeah, one of the early things also of 67-68 was something called Images of the World in the Year 2000.
Looking forward.
Together with Johan Galtung and 20-30 scholars from a dozen different countries, interviewing 11,000 people in several countries in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, India, Japan, and so on.
I remember
about
that study.
what they believed, hoped for, and feared in the future, in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 2000, which was 32 years ahead by then. And eventually a lot of minor things there, plus one term of about 800 pages came out, analyzing how images of the future depended on social categories, country, personality, and so forth. Later on, a few years ago, we were sitting down to do a follow-up, which was published as a special issue of the journal Futures, where we compared what the man on the street believed, feared, and hoped at that time, what the experts at that time, often called futurologists or something, what they wrote, and to the extent it can already be judged, what actually happened. Conclusion: democracy works. The people was right, the experts not.
With Scandinavia, there seems to have been a network from the very beginning, but where else and how did you actually become tied into what very rapidly became an international movement on peace research?
Speaking of myself, although relatively typical in this respect, one such node were the yearly 1 week courses in Oslo that Johan Galtung was giving, because there peace research, young peace researchers from all over the Nordic countries, and even some others were flocking at his feet. And then some of us stayed stayed at Prio for a bit longer periods.
Yeah.
The other meeting place was IPRA.
Of course.
The second IPRA conference was held in Tällberg in Sweden in 1967. And there again, a lot of Scandinavian Nordic peace research met each other, but also met people from other places in Europe and Asia, and at that time only North America. So one thing that, if I use my sociological spectacles, was that the networking among peace researchers was special in the sense of bringing together people who were much more junior. Usually academic networking, starts with more senior people and they form something, but peace research, I should also mention the so-called Nordic peace research conferences every second year, 64, 66, 68, and so on, was also a meeting place for Nordic and some other Polish, Scottish, what have you. That the average age of participants was much lower than the average age of, let's say, the conferences of professional organizations, sociologists or psychologists or philosophers. And this was to some extent in the anti-feudal ideology. Johan Galtung had this, as we call it, feudal model, where the strong contacts are between the top dogs, whether they like or dislike each other. And then they have contacts to their underdogs, but practically no contact between the underdogs. And it was a piece of early peace research ideology to break up that state of affairs and to have direct contact between the underdogs at different universities.
And of course, the underdogs were the the youngsters. Yeah. Some of the other people that we talked about have also mentioned Pugwash as a place where people met. Did that involve these members of your group of peace researchers from the universities in Sweden?
There was some linkage, although the Pugwash leadership tended to be more senior and tended to be people from medicine, natural sciences rather than social sciences. I recall in 1968 there was a Pugwash meeting in Sweden, which I attended, and that was quite interesting. That was when Pugwash was still in its early phase. It started as being, the only place where scholars from East and West could meet each other. And of course, gradually it lost more and more of that monopoly position. But in 1968, there was still quite a number of interesting presentations. And it was also socially interesting. I noted, for example, that the Israeli and Yugoslav scholars had no language problem. They spoke Hungarian to each other.
Hungarian.
Some of the United States and Soviet Union scholars also had a common language, which was Yiddish.
Of course, yes. Did you, as Swedish peace researchers and Swedish institutions, Sweden has always occupied this bridging position between East and West, the free world and the communist bloc, however you want to describe it.
At least, that has been pretty much a Swedish self-image.
Well, do you think it's justified? Was it justified in peace research? Did you make contact with interested people in Poland and the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Obviously with Finland, but...
Yes, but Finland belongs to us. Yes, since the late 60s we had contacts with Polish, Czech, Yugoslav, Hungarian scholars. Some of them were in this big study of the images of the world in the year 2000. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Slovenia was. But we had the same experience as so many others. One had to understand what was going on. That what was said in the official sessions was regarded as a ritual, and talking Turkey was something doing over a cup of coffee between the sessions, when they were often saying something quite different from what they had been just standing up in the official session saying. But we understood that they regarded this official session as some kind of rituals that the powers that be demanded.
Yes.
And then, I mean, in some cases, there was a third option, and that was to talk Padrusham on one's soul, but that usually took quite a lot of vodka. And then one could, to some extent, get to know what they really thought.
Yes. We've talked about people coming into the field in the early days and your background, and one of the things that it's always claimed to be peace research or conflict research is it's always claimed to be sort of multidisciplinary. It's sort of claimed to. Do you think that this is a genuinely accurate picture of the field? And what would you say, you mentioned game theory, were some of the important concepts that the field borrowed from outside and used fruitfully?
It is accurate as a picture of ambitions and to some extent of self-image. I would also say that it has some coverage in reality. There have been different notions about what constitutes interdisciplinarity. My own notion is that if we're speaking about research groups, then you have to have people from different disciplines who manage to communicate with each other. And that often takes a half to 1 year, even for people as close as psychologists, philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, historians, just to learn to speak the same language. Because the same terms are used in quite different senses in different disciplines. And the same concept may turn up under different verbal caps. Johan Galtung once put it that well, the lowest level of ambition is to put chapters by different authors from different disciplines together in one book. Higher level of ambition is they're writing the book together. Higher level still is one person writing the book, and then that person, is to be well trained in at least 2 different disciplines. And from that point of view, I think I could call myself interdisciplinary in the sense of being having advanced training in sociology and in philosophy, and rather in quite a bit of mathematics too.
So, in your case, how have you melded these together? Can you give us an example?
The first melding was precisely engaging in game theory, which included mathematical and philosophical concepts. Right. Then moving on from there to game experiments, making it empirical, and involving a colleague who had his main training in psychology. Then I got myself more training in sociology and started looking at other things. So I would say that in many cases the development of a subfield within peace research has imported concepts, ideas, pieces of methodology from different disciplines. But it is difficult, partly because people with ambitions underestimate how long time it takes them just to learn to talk together. I mean, to talk shop together, rather than talking about interdisciplinarity. Secondly, I mean, there are the structural obstacles that what is interdisciplinary then tends to be marginal in 2 or more disciplines. So working on something interdisciplinary, with a few exceptions, is usually not the best idea. I mean, if you are focused on career. It can be in some cases where something brilliant comes out, but not in general. Furthermore, there is one danger with interdisciplinarity, and that is that it becomes undisciplined. That when people, let's say, close themselves in multidisciplinary groups, then they are usually losing one thing, where the traditional hallowed institute and discipline system has something to offer.
Yes.
It is, I can say many nasty things about it, but it has one thing to offer, which is qualified criticism. And it was often more difficult for these groups or people with interdisciplinary ambitions, often bent at encouraging each other and so on. But to get qualified criticism, that was often lacking, which could lead in worst cases to lack of discipline rather than multidiscipline. Not incurable. I mean, some handled it well, and some handled it less well, and became some kind of amateurs, speaking from a researcher point of view.
Yes, it's...
Many of the early people came from the formal or natural sciences, mathematics in the case of Galtung and myself, theoretical physics, chemistry, and so on. Among the founding fathers internationally, Louis Fry Richardson was a meteorologist of quite some reputation. I think he even got a constant named after him. And there is some discussion about where quantitative international politics came from. Some claim that it came from inside political science, and some claim that that early peace research was really pioneering here. Because early peace research had quite a bit of a positivist bent. I was a positivist myself, and still to some extent but I mean, let's say of the Popperian type, I mean, not the type of barefoot empiricism from Midwest universities. But that again, I mean, was pushing the demand for methodological rigor. That also meant that much of traditional political science and realism, thinking about, for example, causes of peace and war, or the character of international subsystems, could be shot at, and we did shoot at it for lacking empirical support. Where are your data? Whereas we, in some cases, I mean, again, I mean, Richardson as a pioneer could present systematically, collectively, statistically analyzed data which would exclude most of traditional wisdom as to what was related to what, because what came out was zero correlation.
all right, well, but that was something I was going to ask you, because the field started off by trying to be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. Now it seems to have proliferated all over the place. I mean, we're talking about peacekeeping, peace building, peacemaking, conflict prevention, conflict mitigation.
Peace industry.
Yes.
Some of my colleagues in the Balkans, are scornfully referring to all these foreigners coming in either to give stupid advice or ask stupid questions. The international peace industry.
Yeah. Did in the early days, did people sort of envisage the peace industry growing up like that, or what was the vision?
Much of the peace industry has nothing to do with peace research, but come from various kinds of bureaucracies.
Yeah. But what was the vision of peace research at the start? What were you aiming for? You were aiming for a new discipline, a social science?
No. Well, we were aiming for getting peace research accepted as academic work. And from this point of view, we succeeded very well. The intermittent UNESCO yearbooks, by them, mid-60s, there was only a handful of genuine peace research institutes. The early nodes were in Oslo, in Groningen in Netherlands, around Bart Röhling, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. But then, 10 years later, there were many times more institutes, there were international organizations, whereas in 1965 there were only 2 professional journals, the Journal of Conflict Resolution and the just started Journal of Peace Research. 10 years later, there was at least a score of professional journals in different languages. And so between the mid-60s and mid-70s, peace research solidified in spite of our having our first crisis in that period. And since then it sometimes got up a bit, sometimes stagnated, sometimes got down a bit and got up a bit again. But it has remained on the academic map since the mid-70s. The first crisis was extension of the general quarrel in social science in those years. Symbolically 68. In peace research, it was a collision between what are sometimes called the old agenda and the new agenda. The old agenda was focusing on issues such as causes of war and possible ways of eliminating such causes, or possibilities of creating peaceful systems, whether by resource to natural science methods or with international laws as an instrument. Understanding the causes of arms races and trying to find ways of decelerating such races or eliminating them. That agenda by the younger generation was often referred to as pacification and as liberal peace research and so on. The new agenda was looking at dominance and dependence, dependencia, exploitation, and possibilities of liberation, whether non-violent or for some even violent. So there were some big clashes at peace research meetings in 1968, 69, 70. I recall one in 69 in Copenhagen. The other international organization which called itself then Peace Research Society International, then changed to Peace Science Society to be politically more acceptable. I mean, with Walter Isard and others as leaders. 1969, there was a big meeting in Copenhagen, and there were some of the young radicals like Herman Schmid and Lars Stensik from Lund, Hannes Borsop, and a couple of others from Copenhagen who were blasting what they call liberal peace research. Galtung was quite nettled to find himself categorized as that. But Kenneth Boulding had the perfect rebuttal. I want to protest. I'm not a liberal. I'm conservative. I'm voting for Nixon.
He said that?
Yes, and they stopped accusing him of being a liberal peace researcher. But that was the first crisis, and it resulted in some of the diehards on either side leaving in a huff. Some of the diehards of the old agenda leaving in a huff, saying that the whole thing has become revolution instead of peace. And some of the diehards of the new agenda, when they couldn't get it their way, having pieces that all redirected, that also left in a huff. And often left research altogether. But majority stayed and established peaceful coexistence between the agendas, and in some cases, I mean, even fruitful hybridization between them, like Peter Wallenstein's doctoral thesis in 1973 on structure and war, trying to relate the international trade patterns to international war patterns. So, and also by peace research taking in, for example, Latin American dependencia tradition, some East European Marxist tradition, more of Gandhians and so on, broadened. And broadened too much. Because in 1980, Professor Hylke Tromp in Groningen complained in UNESCO yearbook that peace research is becoming what the black hole is in astronomy, through which any kind of social science research is drawn in and by definitional processes transformed into peace research.
Yes.
So peace research, I mean, got pretty much a problem of focusing, which was much of the work of the 80s. Those institutes that managed to focus more rather than spreading out on many different small things, or who were focused from the very beginning, as was by the law creating the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, was to focus on two project areas. And those who managed to do that usually did quite well, whereas those who continued to spread out thinly on many different things, trying in vain to cover the entire field of peace research, often got into deep trouble.
So, I wasn't at that famous meeting, but we heard the reverberations of it, I think, throughout the field. And I think people said, yes, Johan was somewhat shocked to be categorized as of the old school. But talk a little bit about what happened with the Copenhagen Center, because that was something that you said survived by focus, and I think that's true over a number of other places.
It was the fourth attempt in Denmark.
Fourth?
The first attempt was by a couple of Danish groups who had arranged invitations to Anatole Rappaport and so on in the mid-60s, and they couldn't agree, so it petered out. Second attempt was when Anders Borsop and two others had managed to persuade the then Minister of Education, Helveg Pedersen from the Radical Liberal Party, to get them some grant to pay for renting a house, and they could use their scholarships to do peace research. that was an institute in Hellerup, in the outskirts of Copenhagen, that worked to 1967, 1970, and then they disagreed about what was going to be written in the annual report, and it fell apart. The third attempt was made just after the mid-70s, among others, by who became my first Danish wife, and was. But again, I mean, it never took off, because on the one hand, I mean, the Boserup group wasn't interested, and on the other hand, the traditional political scientists weren't interested either, and on the third hand, some of the radical groups regarded, I mean, this is something bourgeois. The fourth attempt started by Anders Boserup, who was had two very famous parents, one economist and one anthropologist. So he was very well connected also in the political scene. And in the early 80s, he managed to get some of the friendly parties to set up some committee to study possibilities, and eventually that came with the report, and that led to opening in early 1985, the fourth attempt, and that was very shaky in the beginning, but eventually solidified and lasted for, well, when we had the wake, it was 18 years, almost.
And how did you become involved in that? Because you were the first director?
No, the first 3 years was first nobody, and then they had pro tem a German who was trying to run a Danish institute in German style, and well, that didn't work. And then there was again an interregnum, and then in mid-1987 I was walking at this big walking street in Copenhagen, Strøget, and there I was meeting an old friend, and we were sitting down to have a beer. And he told me that they had just announced the directorship of the new institute in Copenhagen. So that's how I found out about it over a glass of beer. I eventually applied, as did several others, and after quite a bit of brouhaha, because Boserup thought that he was self-evident for it. I became director in September '88, and then I took 2 extensions. I was sitting for 13 years before retreating with that position.
And did you have some very clear ideas about what you wanted to do in Copenhagen when you took over, and how did that go?
Well, that was to some extent already predetermined by the law creating the institute, laying down that it was to focus on the one hand on non-offensive defense. That was Boserup's specialty.
Yes.
And on the other hand of what was then called non-military aspects of European security.
Yes.
So when I became director, I was also director of this project group on non-offensive defense, and we got Barry Buzan as director of the other group.
Oh, Barry, I didn't know so.
And we started on the same day, and we more or less left. Well, we were both there to the bitter end, to the wake. Then I was transferred into this new mongrel, merging 4 institutes and Barry
Barry went
dropped further connections with Copenhagen.
Right, yes.
And so from that point of view, Summit was predetermined. And then gradually we got the board to accept extensions to new projects as we gradually grew. One on Nordic or eventually Nordic Baltic security, which went very well. One on conversion, which never really took off after a few minor publications. And eventually one on global governance. But I mean, so we added on average every 3-4 years we added a new project as we got more grants and could hire more people. And to some extent, I mean, that reflected what I would have preferred myself. I mean, to some extent it was compromises. I think rather in other dimensions, I was pushing for it to become primarily an academic institution, a scholarly center, as against those who wanted to get much more involved in activism to please the supporting parliamentary parties, and therefore were pushing for being more forthcoming in writing policy proposals and doing in-house publishing. And one of the first things I came with was no in-house publishing. If things are not good enough to be published after reviews at journals and publishing houses, we shouldn't waste paper and working time on them here. And this initially that scared people, but then they found out it worked. The things were good enough. So this is what COPRI came to focus on. I mean, in these areas in which we worked, we generally did quite well in terms of international publication. The second evaluation noted that in comparison with comparable institutes in Nordic countries, we were between 2 and 3 times as productive.
So
I mean,
what happened to undermine it and lead to the wake?
My thinking here was that if we focused on becoming academically very good, then we will get fairly unassailable, and it will not matter much whether this government or that government is sitting, because the ministry will take pride in us and will protect us. The mistake I made was that calculating that the normal thing in Danish politics for decades had been that the Radical Liberal Party was pivotal. And it was, let's say, a liberal right-wing in economic and similar matters, whereas it was left-wing in issues of foreign policy, military defense policy and so on. And they had remained pivotal for decades. So one could get in Denmark a center left-wing government with them in, or a central right-wing government with them in,
but they were in,
or a minority government tolerated by them even if they were not in. Then happened what hadn't happened for a very long time in Denmark, that there was a slide to the right, so that the Radical Liberal Party was no longer pivotal. The two conservative parties could get a majority from the extreme right and didn't have to get it from the center. So it was pretty much a Berlusconi situation that they could get the majorities from the center or from the extreme right. They talked much about finding broad solutions, but in most important things they got a majority from the extreme right rather than from the center. And so from the very outset, I mean, they had the Axis out after peace research, after the Center for Human Rights, and to some extent a couple of others, and then plans for merging them, and now we have the whole catastrophe there. 4 institutes merging into one. But in terms of what I regard as serious publication, that is internationally published books, the whole new Colossus publishes less than Copy did in its time.
What a pity that it became political football in Denmark.
It's very often a catastrophe when politicians are getting into managing things, whether left-wing or right-wing.
All right, let me ask you just 2 or 3 more. One of the things that certainly seems to have characterized the field is that it's always attempted to be practical and applied and useful and realistic. Do you think that was a good thing? Do you think that we've succeeded in any ways of having an effect on the real world?
To start with, I agree that this has very much been a part of Peace Research self-image. When I look, however, at what's published in the Central Peace Research journals, or in proceedings from Peace Research conferences, in many cases, I mean, the connection to anything practical or activist is very indirect at most, and many of the chapters or articles published could just as well have turned up, I mean, in an international relations journal. So, I mean, in self-image, in proclamations, it has been there from the very beginning. In reality, that has to be taken with a grain of salt. We presumably do find more of action orientation in among peace researchers than among neighboring disciplines. But I mean, the difference is not drastic. And there are some cases where peace research indeed has made a difference, but these are more tied to individuals. I mean, Johan Galtung has appeared as a mediator in many conflicts in Latin America, in Sri Lanka, Kashmir, and so on and so forth. And there have also been others like Peter Wallenstein and his team appearing up in Solomon Islands.
Oh yes, Peter told me that story.
And there were a few other cases, but it's not as widespread. I mean, our pieces or self-image would have us believe.
You were talking.
I'm trying to say that there are essentially 3 roles open for peace researchers. One is the advisory role, to whisper something in the ears of the prince, and some go for that. Problem with that role is that then you have to speak the language of the powers that be, and since that language is often newspeak, that means that once you accept to speak that language, you have nothing to say any longer. Or you are just used as legitimation. Well, we have researchers dealing with this, where the politicians don't take at all into account what is being concluded. Then you have the road of pretty much the same, but with, for example, the peace movement or opposition movements and so on, as your audience. Sometimes the problem can be similar. Galtung told in the early days of PRIO, they sometimes got phone calls from the foreign ministry and sometimes from the peace movement, starting the same way. We propose that you make a study to prove that. But I would definitely feel more at home as advisor to peace movement or to regime opposition than to powers that be, whether left or right. Although there is the third role, what I call the Cassandra role. Cassandra, as I take it, you remember your Iliad, had one blessing and one curse. The blessing was that she could see into the future. The curse was that nobody would believe her. Because a warning about likely consequences of political actions, of so-called peacekeeping or peace enforcing or whatever actions, and so forth. Johan Galtung and I were sitting down counting, it turns out, well, we are right much more often they are wrong. But it's usually quite unpopular politically to make the predictions. Eventually they turn out to be right. That may change some minds, but not sufficiently to believe it's the next time we warn against something.
Well, it also makes you unpopular. There's nothing quite so unpopular as being right.
As being right too early. This is what I saw in Eastern Europe with a number of the Marxists there who used their Marxian analysis, to analyze the so-called real socialism they were living in and predicting its downfall or asking for drastic chances. It turned out, in historical perspective, they were absolutely right, but they were right too early, so they were usually persecuted by the party.
So, you sound a little disappointed. Do you think, looking back, that the field's not fulfilled some of the original hopes and dreams that you had in those days?
Whatever does.
Well,
I think...
what's the balance?
Better than average. I'm not disappointed.
Oh, okay. That's nice.
And we continue to get bright young people interested in peace research. I see that I appear now and then sitting in committees or serving as a faculty discussant or sitting in appointment committees, in PhD committees and so on. Yes, I see quite a number of bright young people are coming in, although they're not as young as we were. Our career started long before getting PhDs. Today, a young researcher in peace research, is somebody who is about finishing his PhD or has just had it. So the young researchers are much older today than we were. We have a wider territory that's inhabited by 4 tribes. The Peace Research Tribe, the Strategic Studies Tribe, the International Relations Tribe, and the Political Science Tribe. And as we compare over time and over space, we find different combinations or coalitions and counter-coalitions of these tribes. In some periods, the Political Science Tribe has managed to engulf almost the entire territory. In some periods, the coalition is between political science and international relations, on the one hand seeing themselves as the more academic and seeing strategic studies and peace research as the type of more less academic and more policy or action oriented. And this is sometimes given even strategic studies and peace research common interests in there being criteria defined that don't automatically discriminate against them. That criteria not only be criteria of quote-unquote pure research, but also criteria to assess quote-unquote applied research. Sometimes the main coalition has been between international relations and peace research as against attempts from political science tribe to take it over, or in attempts of one or the other to break out from the political science tribe to get its own territory. So, I mean, what coalitions and counter coalitions we have gotten in claims for this larger territory, that has changed. And both, it's been different in different countries according to circumstances, and something changed in the same country over time.
But I think sometimes, following up the metaphor, there are sort of intellectual battles as well between the tribes. And I wonder, you seem to imply a little earlier that peace research was a sort of a reaction against the sort of power politics paradigm. Did that actually play a role, do you think, in its intellectual development, or was that just a very narrow idea?
In its early development, yes, I think it played a role because it was a challenge to creativity. What are better ways? And to some extent, what was once taken for granted within peace research, I mean, as a goal, was peace by peaceful means. Later on, I mean, as peace research departments were primarily competitors to international relations or political science. This by peaceful means was increasingly dropped as a restriction.
Peace by.
And one got into research on, for example, various aspects of onset of war, or confrontations, and so on. Using various advanced statistical methods, but not being in principle very much different from traditional realism or neorealism notion of using the whole spectrum of methods. I mean, to me it came in the 1990s as a bit of a shock. When looking at developments in the former Yugoslavia, with all this internal tragedy and all, and all that was added to that by external meddling. And if anybody had told me 10 years earlier that a number of my colleagues in peace research and a number even my old friends in the peace movement would advocate military interventions, and that some of our main allies against that would be senior generals, I would never have believed it.
Certainly a turnaround, wasn't it?
And I think to some extent there may now be a swing that increasing number of people in peace research, I mean, are more meant to use the classical formula, peace by peaceful means. Then that of course the issue, what are peaceful means? And I mean, in the early history of peace research, including myself, economic sanctions were seen as something that could be an alternative to horrible war, as a way of acting out conflicts and trying to improve situations by putting pressure in this form. But later on, I discovered that economic sanctions can be a far worse genocide than conventional war.
Yeah. Okay. Supposing you were to have the Cassandra-like ability to look into the future for peace research anyway, or perhaps to wave a magic wand and put it in a particular set of new directions, what would you like to see peace research doing in future? We've talked about the past, we've talked about recent developments. Where would you like to see it go in the future?
Well, largely by that formula, peace by peaceful means. I mean, more research both on classical cases and of potential new cases of non-violence as a method. Well, let me take one concrete example. In the early 80s, I was sitting in for a while in the starting phase of a project for a Jordanian-Palestinian cooperation committee. A project that was to be precisely on the possibilities of using non-violence in the occupied areas. Then my period, which was precisely a starting up period, was over, and a few years later, when the first Intifada came, it struck me when I was trying to disregard, this thing that always interests journalists most, violence in any form, throwing stones, which was to my mind symbolic rather than violent, because you go all the way back to the Old Testament, and throwing stones is a way of expressing contempt. But looking at other things going on, finding out how they open and close shops, how they set up an alternative social security system, and so on, struck me. This is like taken out of a textbook on non-violence. And then the next thing that struck me was, well, it actually is. Because the year before, so large parts of G.N. Sharp's The Politics of Nonviolent Action had been translated into Arabic and published in East Jerusalem. And about the same time, in 1986, I think, appeared a book written by an old friend and colleague of mine who had induced me in the planning phase, a book called Al-Muqawma al-Madniya, on civilian mass action, which was precisely about this. And the author, Al-Hadi Khalaf, told me that before that went into print, Arafat had written it.
Really?
So, second reflection, this was taken out of textbooks on non-violence.
Last two questions then. One is one that we ask our Scandinavian colleagues, and that's it's so interesting that peace research, one of its strongest roots, came out of the Scandinavian countries and not elsewhere. Why do you think that was? Why is there this? Is it a Scandinavian tradition of being interested in peace? Is it an unanswerable question because there are different answers for different Scandinavian countries? But if you look at the Nordic region or whatever it is, and you look at peace research, there's a very strong correlation. Why?
One thing here is perhaps a more general cultural factor. I would broaden Nordic to Puritan Protestant.
Ah, okay.
That's where you find early peace research in Scandinavian countries, northern Germany, Netherlands, England, and North America, United States and Canada. And this happens to coincide by and large with the Protestant zone. Later on, I mean, pieces are broadened today. Not many would link it to this Protestant and in the Anglo-Saxon case, Protestant Quaker. The second thing was that in some cases official legitimacy was to be had because the Nordic countries identified themselves as fairly peaceful ones. Sweden and Finland by among other things, I mean, links to non-alignment and strong UN orientation. Denmark and Norway by having restricted membership in NATO, no nuclear weapons in peacetime, no foreign bases in peacetime, and a strong orientation to the UN. And then was to some extent a matter of persons. I mean, like Tage Erlander, the Prime Minister, Ylva Myrdal and so on, getting behind the idea in Sweden. In Denmark, the third attempt was backed up, I mean, by the Minister of Education from the Radical Liberal Party. In Lund, we happened to be backed up by the by the politically conservative but mentally liberal Vice Chancellor of the University in Germany, whether it was 1969 or 70. The president, Social Democrat Gustav Heinemann, managed to get quite a lot moving. I mean, with big funding set up and so on, and that lasted for a long time in the first wave. And German peace research is still going quite well. I mean, 2, 3, 4 years ago, there was a new large fund of 50 million Deutsche Mark, let's say about 25 million euro, set up, which is to promote research and education in peace research. So Germany, you also have, I mean, the Protestant factor, because rather much of peace research in Germany, although not all, is in a Protestant zone.
Supported by the Länder, do you think? By the sort of local governments or the federals?
Yes, I mean, there's also been a correlation that when the Social Democrats are in land government, they tend to support and the Christian Democrats, well, that differs. I mean, sometimes they are supportive, sometimes they are antagonistic. I think that depends to some extent on how well peace research has been able to establish itself academically. If it has, I mean, then the conservative governments will often respect that. If it hasn't, I mean, some of the ideological controversies come up.
If you'd been sitting in this chair where I'm sitting and interviewing Håkan Wiberg, what would you have asked? What question would you have asked that you would like to answer that I haven't asked? What would be something that I've missed?
Not much, perhaps the third crisis.
And how would you have answered?
The first two crises we have already discussed. I mean, the clash between old and new agenda around 70, and the increasing multiplicity and therefore loss of focus.
In the early 80s.
Third crisis was around in the early 90s. and that crisis was partly due to the disappearance, at least in Europe, of the Cold War. And some were saying facetiously that, well, since peace research was invented as an alternative to the Cold War, and the Cold War is no longer there, I mean, why not close it down? Some of the critics of peace research even seem to be serious in saying that. So there was in peace research, both after the internal disagreements in the 90s, for example, about military interventions, and also because of the end of the Cold War, I mean, matter of where do we go now? And I would say on that, one answer to that has been focusing more on causes of civil wars, because that has been heavily under-researched areas, and their peace research and others, but particularly peace research has moved in to supplement our knowing considerably. I mean, democracy and peace is a funny thing. If you ask about single states, there is no relation. Several studies have confirmed there is no relation. Democracies are neither more nor less belligerent. If you look at pairs of states, that is about as close as we get to confirm natural law. Democracies don't fight each other, at least not until now. That may be for reasons of who were who and what was the international situation. But at least, I mean, this is something often called the double democracy hypothesis. Democracies don't fight each other. And the third, which has been only really systematically, quantitatively studied in the last 10 years, is that within states, the relationship between democracy, autocracy, and peace war is A-shaped. Least risk for war is stable, that is long-standing democracy is high on democracy. Slightly greater risk in long-standing autocracies, fairly high on autocracy. About 1.5 times as high risk for those in between and who are in transition, both because of that position seems to be dangerous, being in between, and because movement in either direction, to or from democracy, also seems to be dangerous. But that is a new finding from the last 10 years, and peace research now are trying to bore deeper and deeper into whatever complex processes may be behind this is A-shaped. So I mean, and this is also an illustration of how simple ideological formulas are of very little helpful. Peace and democracy sounds nice, but sometimes it's irrelevant, sometimes it's highly helpful, and sometimes it's counterproductive.